Hello, it is December. We've had our first snow day, and I am now about to teach you the last brand new content of 2020. I won't be coming at you again with any new content until 2021. This week, I'm going to be discussing the Fifth Amendment, and it's pretty loaded. And it looks like I've been getting quite a reputation around here.
And because I'm a government teacher, I need to come up with a silly way for you to remember that amendment, because I think it's very important that we take time out of our lives and we memorize the third.
That was Mr. McNichol, and he had a few things incorrect. For one, these aren't silly ways to remember the amendments. They're clever ways, right? And there are 27 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, not 30, Mr. McNichol. You need to retake government class. All right, let's get into the Fifth Amendment and the clever way I'll try to get you to remember it. All right, let's tackle it in the Constitution. We're on page 22, Amendment 5, and in Roman numerals, a 5 looks like a V. Remember, V upside down looks like an A. All right, the Fifth Amendment says, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. We've now read 7 articles and 4 amendments, and so I bet you could probably figure this all out on your own. But just in case, let's break it down line by line. But I mean, first, the most obvious way, GDEDs, right? GDEDs. Grand jury, double jeopardy, eminent domain, due process, self-incrimination. GDEDs. Let's look first at the G in GDEDs. Grand jury.
Some of the most high-profile court cases start with a grand jury. But while most juries look like this, a grand jury does not even involve a trial. A grand jury is used to decide if there's enough evidence to support a criminal charge, and specifically what charges. Grand juries essentially do triage or intake on a case and usually only look into serious felonies like murder, rape, or kidnapping. In a trial, charges have already been presented, and it's the jury's job, with the judge mediating, to decide whether the defendant is guilty or innocent. While a trial jury usually has 6 to 12 people, a grand jury can have as many as 16 to 23 people. The prosecutor presents the case and evidence. The grand jury may request that the court submit further evidence, including witness testimony and subpoenas of documents. Unlike a trial, grand juries operate almost entirely in secret. The press is not allowed into the room, and neither is the public. This allows the defendant and witnesses to speak freely without injuring their reputation if the jury decides not to indict. Witnesses, however, are generally allowed to discuss their testimony. Unlike trial juries, grand juries do not need a unanimous decision to indict. They just need a supermajority, like 2/3 or 3/4, depending on the jurisdiction.
So the important thing to remember about this G in the Fifth Amendment is that if you commit a felony and you're brought up on charges, the grand jury has to look and see if there's enough evidence for you to move on to trial court, or a regular jury then has to unanimously decide if you're guilty or not guilty. And a really important part of this is that you know what you are being accused of and that you are fairly being accused. They have enough evidence to accuse you of something, and they're not just willy-nilly picking something that they want to charge you with. Yeah, I'm not too sure where I come up with some of these terms, but in case you hadn't heard willy-nilly before, there you go. All right, let's move on to the first D in GDEDs, double jeopardy.
Have a choice.
You ever arrest anybody you thought was innocent, but you can't prove it?
She is in New Orleans. She does have a gun. She is looking for you.
She believes that I'm her husband, whom she killed.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Nick. I learned a few things in prison. I could shoot you in the middle of Mardi Gras, and they can't touch me.
Double jeopardy.
Where's my son?
Admittedly, I haven't seen that movie in a really long time, but whenever I mention double jeopardy in class, a student brings up the movie. And so if you've seen the movie, you probably have a pretty good idea. But basically, double jeopardy means that a prosecutor only has one chance to prove you're guilty. And so if you go through the trial and they prove you innocent, your defense proves you innocent, then they cannot retry you again for the same exact crime. A really famous case I always bring up, and I recognize this is before you guys were born, but it's one of the first times I remember paying really close attention to the news, was around 1994. O.J. Simpson was on trial for the murder of his wife, Nicole Brown. He was found innocent. It was a very controversial decision. And years later, there was a book that came out that basically was O.J. Simpson saying, I didn't murder her, but if I had, here's how I would have done it. And because of double jeopardy, even with those statements, he could never again be tried for the murder of Nicole Brown. Years later, O.J. Simpson actually did serve time in jail for robbery and kidnapping, but it was completely unrelated to the case. And that's another story. But something that I do want to clarify is some students sometimes say, oh, so if I am found innocent of stealing, does that mean I can just go steal again? And I want to clarify that double jeopardy means you cannot be tried twice for the same exact crime. So not the same type of crime. So if someone's found innocent of murder, it doesn't mean that they can go and murder anyone else that they want. They could just never be tried again for that particular murder. All right, let's move on to the E, eminent domain. Now, in the Constitution, this is the last part of the Fifth Amendment, and this is when it says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. And let me explain exactly what that means. So the term eminent domain refers to the power of the government to take private property and then convert it into public use. The Fifth Amendment provides that the government may only use this power if they provide just compensation to the property owners, just meaning fair. So they must be giving a fair payment if they are taking private property from someone. The Supreme Court has heard many cases on this, and they have held that as long as taking this property means that a community would enjoy from the economic development, then that's sufficient to qualify as public use, and that's a sufficient enough reason to take private property and offer this just compensation. I've had a few students in the past who have told me their family homes or family land has been taken from them by the government, but they've received payment on it for doing a variety of building or community development. And a really common scenario that a lot of students seem to be familiar with is the ODOT Sucks House right off of 161. About 15 years ago, the state of Ohio decided to expand 161. To do so meant purchasing land from homeowners that lived along the side of that road. And for some of them, it meant that they could no longer live in their homes. And although they were offered compensation from the state, and it was considered just compensation by the state, there was no amount of money that some of these people thought equated to the importance of their home. They took it to court, and the state sided with ODOT, the Ohio Department of Transportation, because they said widening 161 was a benefit for the community, and therefore they were doing everything by law. They were offering just compensation to improve the community. Here's President Trump explaining why he believes eminent domain is a wonderful thing.
Well, I think eminent domain is wonderful if you're building a highway and you need to build, as an example, a highway and you're going to be blocked by a holdout, or in some cases it's a holdout. Just so you understand, nobody knows this better than I do because I built a lot of buildings in Manhattan, and you'll have 12 sites and you'll get 11 and you'll have the one holdout and you end up building around them and everything else. Okay, so I know it better than anybody. I think eminent domain for massive projects, for instance, you're going to create thousands of jobs and you have somebody that's in the way and you pay that person far more. Don't forget, eminent domain, they get a lot of money. And you need a house in a certain location because you're going to build this massive development that's going to employ thousands of people, or you're going to build a factory that without this little house, you can't build the factory. I think eminent domain is fine. Now,
let's continue on our journey through GDEDs and the Fifth Amendment with our second D, due process. This is the section in the Fifth Amendment where it says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Due process simply means fair treatment through the normal judicial system. So with this, you cannot be executed, you cannot have your property taken from you, unless you have been given a trial and rightfully convicted. The government must follow the processes that we've set up by law, and the Fifth Amendment is guaranteeing those protections to you. All right, let's move on to the last part of this amendment, and one you're probably familiar with. Have you ever heard someone say, I plead the Fifth? Have you ever wondered where that came from? So in GDEDs, the S stands for self-incrimination and protection from self-incrimination.
What do you say to that single pregnant woman who might have AIDS, no income, and she needs Daraprim in order to survive? What do you say to her when she has to make that choice? What do you say to her?
On the advice of counsel, I invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. and respectfully decline to answer your question.
Sir, is it true you were a crack cocaine dealer for 7 years?
I plead the fifth.
You couldn't wait to come educate the members of Congress on drug pricing, and this would be a great opportunity to do it. So do you understand you can waive your Fifth Amendment right?
On the advice of counsel, I invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and respectfully decline to answer your question.
Do you think you've done anything wrong?
On the advice of counsel, I invoke my Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination and respectfully decline to answer your question.
Sir, will you tell us about the cartels you dealt with in your time as a crack cocaine dealer?
No, but I can tell you that I plead the fifth.
I am stunned.
To plead the fifth means you have the right not to answer police questions both while in custody or in court. The right against self-incrimination is spelled out in the Fifth Amendment, like I mentioned before, and it also extends to state and local jurisdictions. When someone exercises this right, we're saying that they're pleading the fifth. The Constitution grants this right quite simply. No person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. So at trial, the Fifth Amendment gives a criminal defendant the right not to testify. This means that the prosecutor, the judge, and even the defendant's own lawyer cannot force the defendant to take the witness stand against their will. However, a defendant does have to keep something in mind. They can't choose to testify and then choose not to answer some questions and to only answer some questions. Once you're on the stand, this particular Fifth Amendment right is considered waived throughout the trial. However, when a defendant does plead the fifth, both the judge and the jury are not allowed to take that as any sort of evidence or any other sort of reason to rule a certain way. So jurors can't say, I don't know, they must be guilty because they pleaded the fifth. And a judge can't say, I've decided to rule you guilty because you chose the fifth because you weren't willing to answer my questions. Collection of DNA or fingerprints, and that does not extend to that. So you can't say I plead the fifth and you can't have my fingerprints, or I plead the fifth and you cannot collect my DNA in a criminal case. The Supreme Court has said that this is only communicative evidence or speaking. And then I also want to remind you that this Fifth Amendment right does not apply at home or in your personal life. Mrs. Griffin, when we started this video, weren't you wearing something different? I plead the fifth? The last part of the Fifth Amendment and self-incrimination that I want to discuss is the Miranda warning. If you've watched any TV or movies, I'm going to assume that you've already heard this before. Some of you maybe even have it memorized. And then those of you in our criminal justice program, this is something you've probably already covered in lab.
Miranda rights.
You have the right to remain silent.
You have the right to remain silent.
You have the right to remain silent.
Walter White. You have the right to remain silent.
Most people know their Miranda rights from TV and movies. The right to remain silent, the right to your own attorney, and the right to a free attorney if you can't afford one. But why do people have these rights? And what could they mean for you if you're ever accused of a crime? Well, let's run through 3 big myths about Miranda rights. The first myth is that federal law requires people be read their rights. There actually is no law on this. Instead, Miranda rights are based on the Bill of Rights, which the founders wrote to protect a citizen from being forced to be a witness against himself. The goal was to prevent the government from using its power to force Americans into confessions when their life was on the line. Now, when rich people were accused of crimes, they benefited from that rule. They'd just call their lawyer and avoid the police. But in 1966, the Supreme Court decided that rule should protect everyone. The court had just established a right to a lawyer for the poor, and in Miranda v. Arizona, the court ruled those rights don't mean much if people don't even know they have them. The court ruled that police could not use a confession they obtained from Ernesto Miranda because he wasn't advised of his rights. Police were then required to issue full warnings about suspects' constitutional rights, and those became known as Miranda rights. Another myth is that those rights must be read at the time of arrest. Actually, police only have to read Miranda rights before a suspect is interrogated in custody. So if you are ever arrested and make voluntary statements to police, even without a Miranda warning, that statement can be used against you in court. And then there's the biggest Miranda myth, that a failed Miranda warning is some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. The Miranda rule doesn't dictate anything, though, about whether someone is guilty or innocent. For trials, Miranda is all about evidence. If police violate the requirement, they lose any evidence obtained through that violation, including confessions. But the same suspect can still be prosecuted with any other evidence. The rule is designed to discourage police from abusing Americans' rights, not to reward suspects in any other way. And that's what Ernesto Miranda learned. After the court overturned his conviction because of the use of the confession, he was retried without it, and a new Arizona jury still convicted him. He served about 5 years in prison before being released, and in 1976, 10 years after that case, Ernesto Miranda was killed in a bar fight. The suspect in his death was arrested and read his Miranda rights, so named after his victim.
All right, so there you have it. The Fifth Amendment. We are halfway through the Bill of Rights. We're almost halfway through the school year. This week you have this video. I have another video on due process, and then a Google form for you over the Fifth Amendment. There is a few, there's a PowerPoint attached, and then there's also a short video for you to watch. And then that's it with the new content. Like I said earlier, next week I am going to have an assessment of sorts. And so I do hope that when you come to school on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, that you don't click right to the assessment. I'm going to be providing some review material, so please make sure that you do that before you take the assessment. All right, as always, please reach out if you have any questions or concerns. I am happy to help. Stay safe, stay warm, and enjoy this week.